Hi, my name's Andy Chamberlain. I'm a writer and creative writing tutor, and this is the Creative Writers Toolbelt video channel, giving you practical, accessible advice that you can apply straight away to your own writing. And in this episode, I'm going to answer the question, what do great stories look like? Now, from the moment when our distant ancestors started to be social and started to communicate with each other, they started to tell each other stories. And these stories have educated and entertained people for millennia. They have helped us to establish who we are. They've helped to give us an identity as individuals and in groups. And they've helped us to make sense of the world. So stories are important. And telling stories in oral or written form is a high and important calling. The storyteller and author Marie Bilodeau says this about the power of stories. Fiction and storytelling speaks to longing and fears, romance and tragedy. It gives us a sense of meaning that we might not see in our own lives. But how, as writers, can we capture and harness that potential? Well, here's the interesting thing. When we look at stories, the stories that have endured, that have been around for hundreds or thousands of years, we find two important things. First of all, they tend to be about the same themes. They tend to focus on the same sorts of things. The things which interested people millennia ago and interest people now, today as well. The second important thing is they tend to have the same kind of structure, and we'll explore what that is in just a moment. If we start with just the themes, when we look at the stories that have endured, they tend to be about the same sorts of things. They tend to be about the hero's quest, they'll be about conflict, they're about power, they're about love and romance, they're about human beings encountering the gods or nature, they're about human beings testing themselves. So many of them seem to be about a challenge and seem to be about a conflict and its resolution. Now bear in mind that all of these stories come from unconnected places. We're talking about stories and myths that have come from around the world. The people who created them have had no connection with each other. These things have sprung up independently in multiple different places. And it's not just the themes and topics that come up, it's also the structure of the story. What I mean by that is that great stories seem to have a similar dynamic. They start with the introduction of a character or a setting or a situation, and then the action of the story is propelled usually by some kind of significant incident that happens. It's like an event that's a catalyst for the story. And storytellers and people that are interested in story tend to call this the inciting incident. The story then moves towards a climax. These two opposing forces grow and then they gradually come together in some kind of conflict. And that conflict has to be resolved one way or another. And afterwards, the story calms down again and a new normal emerges. A new reality for the story comes to pass. People who are interested in story tend to refer to the part of the story where the tension builds, where things are moving towards some kind of climax and some kind of conflict as the rising action in the story. And then after the conflict, we have the falling action. This is the part of the story towards the end where we move from the conflict down to the conclusion, the resolution of things. Most classic stories tend to have this shape of a rising action and then a conflict and a falling action, like a kind of arc or a hill shape. And this shape and the points along it have been studied by different people for centuries. So there's this commonality between great stories in terms of theme and structure. And as examples of this, I want to tell you two very brief and very old stories. Now, if you know these stories and I pronounce a name wrong in it, I apologise now. Please do leave a comment in the comment section and tell me how it should be correctly pronounced. The first story is called Rama's Bridge. Now, this is an ancient tale which comes from an epic Indian poem which was written about 1800 to 2,500 years ago. In this story, the crown prince, Rama, is forced to relinquish his right to the throne and goes into exile in a forest for 14 years. And during this time, his wife, Sita, is abducted by an evil demon king, Ravana, and taken to Sri Lanka. Rama wants to rescue his wife, and so he and his brother Lakshman build a bridge from India across to Sri Lanka with the assistance of some bears and monkeys. And Rama and his forces come into conflict with the demon king Ravana. They go to war, and Ravana is eventually defeated. Rama returns home with his wife to be crowned king. So this story starts with some scene setting. We have Rama and we have his wife Sita, and Rama is in exile and they're in a forest. And that, if you like, is stage one of the story. And then we have the inciting incident. Sita is kidnapped by the demon king. And that is the incident, it's the inciting incident, which then gives the story its engine, gives it the energy to drive all the way through to the end. We see the rising action part of the story where Rama and his brother go over to Sri Lanka. They build a bridge with the help of these bears and monkeys, and they go to Sri Lanka to get Sita back. And that draws us in, rises the action towards a climax and a conflict. And that conflict then happens, and we know that there's only going to be one winner from that conflict. Where afterwards, once the conflict has happened, the story then falls back down to its conclusion. There is falling action. Rama has rescued his wife, and all is well at the end. If we look at the themes in this story, we can see some very familiar ones from the list that I made earlier. There's a bit of romance, there is conflict, there is quest, there is power, there is some revenge, and there's also an exploration of the deities, of the gods. This is a very ancient and perennial theme across a lot of different stories, across a lot of different myths. Mankind watching or engaging with the deities, or watching and engaging with nature. That's my first example. My second one comes from a very different part of the world. This is the story of Crater Lake. Now, this is a myth from the native Klamath people who live in South Oregon and Northern California. And Crater Lake is the deepest lake in the United States. It's got a depth of about 590 meters, and it was formed about 7,700 years ago by the collapse of a volcano, Mount Mazama, and the resulting crater filled with rainwater, forming Crater Lake. Now, the Klamath people consider Crater Lake to be a sacred site, and there are a whole range of myths and tales that have sprung up around this site. And I'm going to share with you very briefly just one of them. Now, this myth states that this crater was created by a massive battle between the sky god, Skell, and the lord of the underworld, Liao. And Liao and Skell were adversaries, and they'd had a number of conflicts before this time. But this one was particularly ferocious, causing the earth to split and shake as the two parties involved threw fire and rocks at each other. The land was scorched and fiery black ash rose everywhere, which reflects the fact that the crater was created by a volcano. During the battle, darkness covered the land as Liao, standing on Mount Mazama, and Skell, standing on Mount Shasta, continued to throw rocks and flames at each other. But then the fight ended when Mount Mazama collapsed and sent Liao back into the underworld. Now, clearly, there are some of the themes that we've already talked about in this story. Conflict, nature, the deities at war. So that is all present. But also, again, the structure of it is similar to something we've already seen. The build-up to this battle, albeit in this very short version, is quite brief. But then we have the climax and then the conflict of the battle itself. And again, there is one winner. In this case, it's Skell. And afterwards, a new normal, a new reality is created. The themes that come up and the themes that are engaged by these stories and many others from antiquity are things which still attract us. As I said, there's things like romance and love and the hero's quest and conflict and our engagement with the gods and with nature. The structure of really great stories is similar, and there are important lessons for us as writers here, as these great stories show us what kind of themes we should be using, what kind of structure we should be using for the stories that we want to tell, for the books and novels that we want to write. And we can still present our own contemporary characters and contemporary subjects in our stories, but it's worth bearing in mind these lessons, if you like, that humanity has learned from long, long ago about what is successful in terms of storytelling. So I hope this episode has given you some idea of what great stories look like. In the next episode, we'll dig a little bit deeper into the fundamentals of story, and we'll start to build a practical model of what a good story should look like. So please do leave any comments you have on this episode below. Subscribe to the channel so that you'll be able to find out when new episodes come along. And if you want more insight into the craft now, check out the Creative Writers Toolbelt podcast. There's over 100 episodes of teaching and insight from artists and illustrators, editors, writers and agents. And you can also find all that best advice and insight condensed into one book, the Creative Writers Toolbelt Handbook, which contains advice from all of my guests from the last few years on the podcast. And there's a link to the podcast and the handbook in the comment section below. So that's it for now. Thank you again for watching, and until next time, goodbye.